They say the jungle forgets, that it swallows memory whole and buries time beneath its tangled canopy, letting vines grow over the bones of history until nothing remains but whispers. And yet some stories refuse to die. They pulse beneath the surface like ancient drums, echoing from the deep green, refusing to be silenced. One of these stories begins in the shadowed foothills of the Andes, where rivers vanish into mist and mountains seem to watch with eyes of stone. A tale once dismissed as fevered fantasy, now resurfacing with unnerving clarity, the story of El Gran Paititi. A lost city, or perhaps an entire empire spoken of in frightened tones by natives sought feverishly by conquistadors, and for centuries sealed behind the walls of dense foliage and academic denial. Welcome, fellow seeker of forgotten things. Tonight we embark on a journey through silence and smoke, through official records and hidden truths, through jungles not just of trees, but of meaning. And we begin not with a claim, but with a paradox. For all our satellites, all our mapping, all our machines, there remains a vast and uncharted world just beyond the edge of what we consider known. In the 21st century, we speak of global knowledge, yet there are entire regions of South America so dense, so remote, that they remain almost mythological. This contradiction between modern certainty and ancient obscurity is precisely where Paititi lives. Not merely as a place, but as an idea. One powerful enough to survive the collapse of empires and the silence of centuries. The first written account of Paititi does not come from folklore or native legend, but from the hands of a European priest, Andres Lopez. In a letter dated to the early 1600s, stored for centuries in the restricted Vatican archives, Lopez described a city of immense wealth, hidden deep within the jungles east of Cusco, a city ruled by an Incan elite who had fled the Spanish conquest, carrying with them the last vestiges of their culture, their treasures, and their gods. His account, long dismissed as apocryphal or romanticized, contains geographical references and cultural markers that are only now, with modern imaging and archaeological modeling, beginning to look startlingly accurate. But why, one might ask, was such a letter not considered a major historical source? Why did the world look away? The answer perhaps lies in how we construct reality. History, after all, is not a simple recording of facts. It is an architecture of memory, shaped by those who write it. The story of the Americas, as told by European powers, required closure. The Incas fell. The jungle was empty. The conquest was total. To acknowledge Paititi would be to reopen a chapter that was meant to be sealed forever. It would suggest that the Inca legacy did not vanish. It adapted, survived, and concealed itself in a place no colonizer could ever reach. And yet, the clues are everywhere, like scattered pieces of a broken mirror, reflecting glimpses of something far greater than we have been told. In the remote region of Madre de Dios, satellite images have revealed unnatural geometric patterns, linear depressions, parallel lines, and mound-like formations now buried beneath forest. To most eyes, they're just curious formations. But to archaeologists studying ancient urban planning, these are the unmistakable fingerprints of civilization. Sophisticated, intentional, lost. The question that begins to haunt us then is not whether Paititi existed, but why so many have worked to forget it. We often imagine the jungle as wild, unknowable a place where nature reclaims all. But what if that's only half the truth? What if the jungle has also been protecting something, guarding not just ruins, but memory? What if beneath the sound of howler monkeys and rustling canopies, there is a silence not born of absence but of suppression. Even local tribes speak of a sacred city forbidden to outsiders. Elders refer to a place where the sun touches the earth directly, where the stones sing and gold flows like rivers. To many, these stories are just oral mythology. But in cultures without written language, myth and memory are inseparable. Every legend is a vessel carrying fragments of truth, too dangerous or sacred to name directly. If Paititi was real, and evidence increasingly suggests that it was, it must have served a purpose beyond gold or grandeur. Perhaps it was the last sanctuary of a dying world, a final attempt by Incan priests and scientists to preserve knowledge culture, even technology, in a place so remote no conqueror would follow. And perhaps they succeeded. This is where our journey truly begins, not with treasure maps or conquistador diaries, but with the idea that history is not a single thread, but a tapestry, and that one thread deliberately pulled loose can unravel the entire weave. What does it mean if a vast, highly organized Incan refuge still exists beneath the forest floor? What if the final chapter of one of the world's greatest civilizations was not written in blood and ruin, but in secrecy and endurance? We must ask then, who benefits from the myth of a vanished Inca? Who decided the jungle was empty, and who has the most to lose if that lie is undone? As we continue forward, we'll trace the steps of explorers who vanished without a trace. We'll examine records long buried in European archives. We'll analyze aerial images scrubbed from public access. And we'll listen closely to the voices that were never meant to survive the quiet songs of a people who refused to disappear. Because maybe, just maybe, Paititi was never truly lost. Maybe we were simply never meant to find it. The year is 1925. Colonel Percy Harrison Fawcett, a British explorer of fierce intellect and unshakable resolve, disappears into the Brazilian jungle with his son in search of what he called the City of Z. Though mocked by some in his time, Fawcett believed with all his being that an advanced civilization lay hidden in the vast, unexplored interior of South America. What few realize is that the clues he pursued bore uncanny resemblance to older whispers of Paititi. He spoke of a land beyond the mountains, structured and ancient, shielded from the world by dense green walls and collective disbelief. Neither Fawcett nor his party were ever seen again. Some say they perished. Others believe they found something and chose never to return. His obsession was not unfounded. In private letters to the Royal Geographical Society, Fawcett described carving strange ruins and legends that matched nothing in known records, yet somehow echoed the shape of civilizations long past. What compelled him to risk everything? What convinced a rational man of science to leave behind the known world in pursuit of something thought to exist only in legend? The answer, once again, lies in contradiction. For centuries, the official doctrine held that the Amazon basin could not support large sedentary populations. The soil, they said, was too poor. The climate too hostile. And so, when tales emerged of great cities and engineered canals deep within the jungle, they were dismissed, not because they lacked evidence, but because they contradicted the assumptions of empire. To accept them would mean accepting that a people labeled primitive were in fact highly sophisticated. It would mean rewriting the very story of conquest itself. But the land does not lie. In recent decades, archaeologists using LiDAR light detection and ranging have begun to uncover what the eye could never see through the thick forest cover. Massive earthworks, long straight causeways, planned agricultural zones. Beneath centuries of overgrowth lie remnants of what may have been a complex network of settlements stretching across thousands of kilometers. The very existence of these structures defies the long-held myth of an untouched wilderness. This was not nature's empty canvas. It was a world crafted by human hands, then consumed by time and silence. Could one of these lost centers have been Paititi? The more one looks, the more the myth begins to resemble a memory. We find references to a golden kingdom, not only in Spanish accounts, but in native cosmologies, where a place of origin, often veiled in metaphor, lies eastward, hidden sacred. The Incas themselves spoke of Amarucancha, the serpent enclosure, a mysterious city of wisdom and prophecy far from the reach of the Spaniards. When Manco Inca and his followers fled Cusco after the siege of 1536, they moved east into the Vilcabamba region, then vanished deeper still. Where did they go? And why have so few returned to ask? Even modern governments have played their part in the silence. In the 1980s, a Peruvian expedition to the Pantiacola region, rumored to be near Paititi, was abruptly cut short. The team reported discovering large stone structures, including what they claimed to be a staircase leading up the mountainside carved directly into the rock. But shortly afterward, all information was sealed, permits rescinded, access restricted. Officially, it was for environmental protection. Unofficially, no one speaks of it. What is being protected, and from whom? There is something unsettling in how often this pattern emerges. Explorers find anomalies. Indigenous communities speak of forbidden lands. Clues begin to surface. And then just as quickly, the silence returns. A kind of historical amnesia, enforced not by lack of evidence, but by the slow erosion of attention. Paititi becomes once more a footnote until someone else dares to look. But why does the idea of Paititi linger so persistently in the human mind? Is it merely the lure of gold, the promise of treasure waiting to be unearthed? Or is it something older, deeper, an echo of our collective longing for something pure, untouched by the corrosive hands of conquest, a place where knowledge was not destroyed, but hidden, waiting to be remembered? Throughout the world, there are stories like this, of sacred lands swallowed by time, of knowledge safeguarded in mountains or beneath the earth. Yet Paititi feels different, not just lost, but deliberately obscured. Not just myth, but warning. In 2009, a group of researchers analyzing high-resolution images from a remote section of the Peruvian jungle noticed something curious: symmetrical mounds aligned in a grid. Closer inspection revealed they were too orderly to be natural. But before the data could be published, the satellite images were pulled offline. Licensing issues, they said. A glitch in the archives. But those who had seen them before their removal described something that did not belong to the forest. It belonged to a civilization with vision, with scale, with purpose. We are left with fragments, half-truths, whispers. Yet these fragments, when pieced together, form a picture that grows harder to deny. Why then has no formal excavation been launched? Why do we hesitate to pull back the vines? Could it be that in uncovering Paititi, we also risk uncovering something far more disruptive, a narrative not of noble conquest and heroic exploration, but of deliberate erasure, of truths buried not by nature, but by design? And if that is true, then what else lies beneath the stories we've been told? As we venture deeper, we'll meet those who have dared to follow the trail. Archaeologists, mystics, survivalists. Some returned with artifacts, others with warnings, and still others never returned at all. What were they chasing? What, if anything, found them first? The trail to Paititi is not marked on any modern map, yet its presence endures, traced through memory, carved into myth, and etched onto the bones of those who sought it. Some followed ancient roads that vanished mid-stride into thickets of poison and fog. Others relied on fragments of oral tradition broken across centuries and tongues. But the most persistent seekers were not always adventurers or gold hunters. They were the ones drawn by something subtler and more dangerous than treasure, a hunger to know what lies just beyond the curtain of accepted history. In the southern Peruvian highlands, just beyond the ruins of Vitcos and Espiritu Pampa, there begins a descent not merely into the jungle, but into an older layer of time. This is the region where the last Inca stronghold once stood, and it is from here that the trail eastward leads into the deep unknown. The Spanish called this land the Antisuyu, the eastern quarter of the Incan Empire, a domain they barely touched and never understood. It was from this direction native lore insists that the ancestors came and to which the exiled high priests returned. Even the Inca themselves spoke of the Antisuyu as a place of beginnings of prophecy of sacred power. We rarely ask why the great empires chose to die slowly rather than surrender, why Manco Inca, after his final retreat, vanished into a region known even to his own people as forbidden. Did he seek a hiding place? Or was he returning to something ancient and prearranged, a sanctuary designed long before the Spanish had ever seen the Andes? According to a number of early colonial accounts, the Inca had not only road systems and granaries, but knowledge centers, archives of stone and song maintained by a caste of keepers known as the Amautas. These weren't priests in the European sense, nor mere scribes. They were memory itself tasked with preserving the sacred cosmology of the world. What if, as the empire collapsed, these Amautas were sent not into hiding, but into preservation? What if Paititi wasn't just a last refuge, but a chosen vault meant to hold something the world was not yet ready to remember? Some say this is fantasy, that no city so grand could vanish so completely. But history is full of silences more profound than ruins. For nearly 2,000 years, the city of Çatalhöyük in Turkey lay buried beneath a mound mistaken for a natural hill. The Khmer road networks of Cambodia remained unseen until LIDAR revealed an empire beneath the trees. Angkor itself was considered myth before its discovery. Paititi is not alone in its disappearance, it is simply more complete. In the dense basin near the Pantiacola mountain range, travelers have returned with strange tales. Carved faces staring out from stone cliffs, stairways leading to nothing but green sky, metallic humming from deep within caves, all dismissed as hallucinations or tricks of the light. But patterns begin to emerge, too consistent across decades, too detailed to ignore. One account, written by a geologist in the 1970s, speaks of an entire terrace of rectangular platforms hidden within a valley, arranged with astronomical precision. He noted how the rocks had been melted and shaped with a technique unknown to modern tools, then recanted the entire story in a later interview. When asked why, he said only, "I was advised to reconsider my findings." Reconsider. That word hangs heavy. What happens when knowledge becomes dangerous, not because it is false, but because it is true? And what systems are in place to ensure that such truths remain behind the veil? The deeper one dives into the subject of Paititi, the more entangled it becomes with secrecy. This is not simply a tale of a hidden city, it is the story of a boundary, a threshold between what we are allowed to explore and what we are not, between history and heresy. Some researchers have begun to whisper of something stranger still, that Paititi is not merely ancient but interstitial, that it exists not only in space but in ritual, that to enter it is not just to walk through jungle, but to pass through a gate in consciousness, a coded set of conditions embedded in myth, song, and landscape. The shamanic traditions of the Machiguenga and the Inca speak of a city that appears only when the seeker is pure. That those who arrive with greed will see only forest, while those with intent aligned to the old ways may pass unseen into another layer of the world. Dismissed as metaphor, these traditions are never studied deeply. Western archaeology, bound to materialist frameworks, has little patience for indigenous cosmology, and yet it is here in this cosmology that the secret might live. Paititi may be less a destination and more an alignment, a place hidden by frequency, not by foliage. And if that is the case, then no map will lead us there. There is a reason, perhaps, why the stories of Paititi have survived in whispers and riddles. Why every expedition that draws close is swallowed. Why satellite imagery distorts. Why funding disappears. Why testimonies are erased. Something is being guarded, whether by the earth itself or by those who fear what its uncovering would mean. Because if Paititi exists, truly exists, then our understanding of the Inca is shattered. No longer victims of conquest, but stewards of a knowledge deep enough to elude even time. No longer a defeated people, but a civilization that outwitted its enemies by stepping sideways into myth, hiding in the very thing we are trained to dismiss story. So we must now ask not only what is hidden in the jungle, but what part of ourselves is kept from remembering it. What if the truth has always been there, just beyond reach, just beyond permission, waiting? The jungle does not reveal its secrets to those who ask questions the wrong way. It is not a vault to be forced open, but a living, breathing labyrinth of thresholds, each one demanding humility, patience, and a kind of reverence long forgotten by modern minds. And yet we persist in trying to conquer it with boots and drones cutting through vines as though cutting through time itself. But those who have come closest to Paititi, closest to whatever lies beneath this veil, have not been the most aggressive. They've been the ones who learned to listen. In the 1980s, a quiet and largely ignored expedition by a Peruvian anthropologist named Dr. Hector Garcia turned the attention of a few cautious researchers toward a new approach, one that did not attempt to overpower the landscape, but to work with it. Garcia spent nearly 3 years living with the Machiguenga people, listening to stories passed down, not in books, but in firelight. He came to believe that Paititi was not merely physical, it was encoded into the very ecology of the forest. Certain birds, they said, marked the boundaries. Certain flowers bloomed only near its outskirts. Even the wind carried signs if you knew how to hear them. In his journals, Garcia describes a particular stretch of forest where the trees bent unnaturally inward, forming what he called a breathing wall of green. There, the air thickened not with humidity, but with a kind of electric tension. His guides refused to enter, not out of fear, they said, but out of respect. That land did not belong to them. It belonged to the ones who had passed beyond the protectors of the old knowledge. Garcia never crossed it. He wrote, "Some places are not meant to be entered by force. Some doors must be invited open." He died of malaria just months after returning. His notes were never published. His findings archived without review. Is this how knowledge is lost? not through fire or war, but through quiet dismissal. As we begin to connect these patterns, a haunting question arises. What if the myth of Paititi was created not to lure seekers toward it, but to keep most of them away? A camouflage made of gold and grandeur, a tale designed to attract only the greedy, only those who would never be allowed to pass. Could it be that the real treasure of Paititi was never its riches, but its ability to remain unseen? This idea, unsettling as it is, begins to make sense the deeper we go. Consider the stories of those who claim to find it. In the 1970s, a French explorer named Philippe Goyenche claimed to have encountered an ancient stone road deep in the Madre de Dios jungle. It was wide enough for 2 wagons, yet overgrown beyond recognition. His team found glyphs they could not translate, staircases leading nowhere, and a perfectly circular platform aligned with the solstice sun. When they attempted to return the following season, the entire path had vanished beneath a flash flood that seemed by all meteorological accounts impossible. Coincidence or consequence? There is a theme running through this mystery, a pattern of disappearance and denial. Not just of the city itself, but of those who draw near. Some vanish, others are discredited, and a few return forever changed. They speak of strange dreams, of feeling watched, of hearing voices in languages they do not know. A biologist on one such expedition wrote in her private diary, "The jungle has eyes. I do not think they are watching to protect themselves. I think they are watching to protect us." Protect us from what? The more we consider the possibility that Paititi was not simply a sanctuary, but a knowledge vault, the more the pieces begin to align. The Inca understood time differently. To them, the future was behind, and the past ahead, what lay visible, was already gone. And what mattered could only be seen by looking inward. Their temples were not just built for ceremony, but for resonance. The walls of Coricancha in Cusco vibrate at frequencies that align with solar harmonics. Stones carved so precisely they appear to be molded. What kind of civilization leaves behind this kind of mastery and then vanishes unless they didn't vanish? Unless they stepped out of the story, we were told, taking their knowledge with them. Knowledge about healing, about astronomy, about the nature of reality itself. Knowledge that could dismantle much of what colonial history was built upon. That could challenge modern models of science history, even human potential. And so, we return to the uncomfortable question, who benefits from forgetting? Is it the institutions of power for whom mystery is a threat? Is it the religions whose narratives rest on conquest, not continuity? Is it the academic establishments unwilling to confront the implications of a civilization that was never primitive, never defeated, just hidden? Even today, access to large regions of the eastern Peruvian jungle is controlled, monitored, and in some cases, quietly prohibited. Permits are denied. Expeditions are quietly discouraged. The reasoning is often ecological, and justifiably so. These are delicate ecosystems home to uncontacted tribes. But perhaps it is also something more. Perhaps the forest is not just fragile. Perhaps it is a lock. And perhaps someone somewhere is making sure the key is never found. But keys have a way of slipping through cracks, of finding those who are ready. And so we must ask ourselves, not whether Paititi exists, but whether we are prepared to confront what it represents. Not a city of gold, but a mirror. One that reflects a history too complex, too sacred, too dangerous for the world we've constructed on its ashes. We must begin to see the myth, not as illusion, but as instruction. A guide for those who are willing to walk, not just into the forest, but into the unknown parts of themselves. Because perhaps after all, Paititi is not waiting to be discovered. Perhaps it is waiting to be remembered. Imagine a place where silence has mass, where the air itself feels charged with meaning not spoken but implied. Imagine standing on the edge of a forgotten stone platform, your feet pressing into a surface carved centuries ago by hands you'll never see, and knowing with unshakable certainty that someone or something is watching, not with malice, not with fear, but with patience, as if waiting for you to understand what you are standing upon. This is what many who've reached the threshold of Paititi have described not awe in the face of architecture, but a kind of metaphysical weight, like a truth too large to be spoken aloud. In the late 1990s, a joint expedition of Peruvian and German researchers arrived in the foothills near Pucharo, a site infamous for its petroglyphs, massive intricate carvings, unlike any known Incan or pre-Incan style. The carvings depict what appear to be complex maps, rivers, mountains, and geometric patterns that suggest alignment with constellations and solstice markers. Locals call it the Wall of Prophecy, and it has long been rumored to point toward the location of Paititi. But when the team published their preliminary report, what followed was not acclaim or further study, it was silence. Funding was revoked. Access to the site was quietly restricted, and the researchers, once vocal, withdrew their statements without explanation. Why? Because to admit that the Pucharo petroglyphs are a map is to admit that someone had charted this region with extraordinary precision long before Europeans arrived. It is to concede that there was, and possibly still is, a network of knowledge, cosmic, geographic, architectural, that challenges the Western narrative of linear progress. And that is not something easily welcomed by institutions built on the myth of discovery. But the jungle, unlike the institutions that fear it, does not forget. It remembers in its rivers. It remembers in its stones. And it remembers in the dreams of those who walk too close to the old paths. There are recurring motifs among those who ventured near what they believe to be Paititi's boundaries. Dreams of serpents winding through the sky, of stairways descending into light, of voices chanting in languages they do not speak, but somehow understand. These experiences have often been dismissed as hallucination side effects of exhaustion or exposure to the psychoactive flora of the Amazon. But what if they are not byproducts, but protocols? What if the Inca and their predecessors developed a way of encoding information, not in text, but in altered states, not in stone tablets, but in living memory, accessed only through initiation? In Incan cosmology, the serpent represents wisdom, the underworld, and the hidden layers of truth. The puma stands for the physical world power and balance, the condor vision and ascension. These are not mere symbols, they are a metaphysical architecture, a guide through layers of reality. Some shamans believe that to access the city of Paititi, one must first pass through these symbolic thresholds, not physically, but spiritually. They say the city reveals itself only when the seeker has harmonized these three inner realms. To modern ears, this sounds like poetry. But to the ancients, it was science. A science of spirit, yes, but no less precise, no less structured, and perhaps even more dangerous to the status quo than any gold. Because if the knowledge stored within Paititi includes not just history, but the mechanics of consciousness itself, then we are not merely speaking of a lost city. We are speaking of a vault of human potential, one deliberately sealed when the world was no longer safe for it to exist in the open. There are whispers that certain individuals, native elders, secret lineages still hold fragments of the old knowledge. That rituals are performed deep within the jungle to maintain the energetic balance of places no longer marked on maps. That songs are sung not to be heard by ears, but by the land itself. And that somewhere within this network of reverence and remembrance, the city waits. But not all who seek it do so with reverence. There have been those who arrived with greed, with tools designed to dig and extract. They rarely make it far. Mechanical failures, sudden illness, accidents without logic. One man, an oil prospector in the early 2000s, claimed to have located a massive stone chamber with inlaid metals via thermal imaging. He hired a team, prepared the equipment set out, and returned 3 days later, incoherent, shaking, claiming he had been shown something and warned not to return. He never spoke of it again. His equipment vanished. His recordings wiped. Perhaps it is superstition. Perhaps the jungle punishes arrogance. Or perhaps the city is not hidden in space, but in ethics. A test not of skill, but of soul. And if so, the myth of Paititi is not simply about what is lost, but about what is guarded. By the land, by the ancestors, by a consciousness older than civilization itself. It forces us to ask how much of what we call myth is simply truth wrapped in protection. How much of what we reject is only rejected because it lies beyond the reach of our control. Standing at the edge of this mystery, we begin to see that the real story of Paititi is not about a place, but a possibility. That humanity at some point may have walked a very different path, one built not on domination, but on harmony, not on conquest, but on communion. And that perhaps in the heart of the jungle, that path still exists, waiting not to be claimed, but to be honored. Not every door should be opened with force. Some doors are waiting for us to remember the way we once knocked. If memory were a living thing, what shape would it take? Would it lie still beneath the moss, waiting for touch? Would it pulse quietly beneath tree roots, carried through soil like blood through a sleeping body? And what if the jungle itself is memory, not metaphorically, but literally an organic archive that records in silence what human tongues have long ceased to speak? There are those who believe Paititi was never built in the conventional sense, but grown into place, coaxed from the earth, in partnership with nature, not in defiance of it. According to oral histories of the Harikbut people, the sacred city is not defined by walls, but by frequencies. It is said to exist in a fold of the world, visible only under specific conditions of time, emotion, and intention. They describe its location not with coordinates, but with rhythms, how the wind must shift, how the river must sound, how the body must feel. And in these descriptions, abstract as they may seem, there lies an encoded instruction, a map not for the eyes, but for something deeper. In 2011, an independent group of ecological researchers working in the Amarakairi Reserve encountered what they believed were signs of unnatural terrain, a ring-shaped depression nearly a kilometer wide, completely symmetrical, hidden beneath thick canopy. Ground exploration was halted by violent storms, as if the land itself resisted intrusion. But what most fascinated the team wasn't the shape, it was the effect the area seemed to have on the instruments. GPS failed. Compasses spun. Audio devices recorded patterns of static that, when filtered, revealed low-frequency hums with mathematical consistency. They called it a geological anomaly, Others called it something else. One of the local guides, an elder of the Harakbut community, listened to the recordings in silence. When asked if he recognized the sound, he nodded and said, "Only, that is the breathing of the old place." We tend to dismiss such responses as poetic, metaphorical, primitive. But what if they are none of those things? What if the knowledge systems of the so-called pre-modern world weren't failed attempts at science, but wholly different branches? Branches we cut off too early before they could show us what they truly held. In the West, knowledge is a ladder always reaching upward, striving to go beyond. But in the Andean worldview, knowledge spirals. It deepens. It circles back on itself, forming layers of meaning that can only be understood through experience, reflection, and alignment with the world. This is the essence of Aini, the Incan principle of sacred reciprocity. Nothing is taken without something being given. No door opens without the right intention. It is not that Paititi cannot be found. It is that it will not be revealed until the seeker becomes a part of the harmony it demands. This may sound esoteric, even mystical. But what is archaeology, if not a kind of conjuring, a resurrection of the unseen through fragments and shadows? And what is science, if not a method of asking the universe to speak, so long as we have the wisdom to listen? In 2015, a young Peruvian filmmaker named Ana Lucia Quispe began interviewing elders across the Cusco and Madre de Dios regions, asking a single question: "What do you know about Paititi?" Most said nothing. A few warned her to stop, but one woman, nearly 90 years old, spoke a sentence that chilled Ana to her bones. She said, "You will not find the city. The city will find you, but only when you've lost what you came to find." Ana never released her footage. In her last blog entry, before disappearing from public view, she wrote, "Paititi is not a place you arrive at. It is a question that consumes you, and when it finally answers back, it will not be in a language you recognize." We do not know where she is now. This is not the only story of someone drawn into the folds of the jungle chasing something intangible. The deeper you search through expedition records, travel accounts, and declassified documents, the more absences you find. Files missing, names redacted, projects initiated, then erased. Not with violence, but with quiet omission. As if someone or something was curating not just what we know, but what we are allowed to remember. The question grows heavier. With each revelation, what is being hidden, and why it's tempting to believe that all mysteries will one day be solved, that enough light will burn away the fog. But some mysteries are not failures of knowledge. They are boundaries, guardians, echoes of a time when truth was sacred and dangerous, and not something to be handled lightly. If Paititi is real, it may be less a forgotten city and more a sentient memory, one that chooses when and to whom it reveals itself. Not because it fears being found, but because it understands the cost of being misunderstood. Because what waits beneath the canopy may not simply rewrite history, it may rewrite us. What happens when we finally see that the greatest truths are not in books or ruins or treasures, but in the spaces we've trained ourselves to ignore, the sacred silences, the inexplicable harmonies, the stories we dismissed as superstition, only to find them waiting unchanged just beyond the edge of certainty. And what happens if we knock and something knocks back? The deeper we move into this story, the more it resists us. Not like a locked door, but like a fog that thickens as you advance, not to turn you back, but to ask if you truly understand what you're seeking. This is the shape of the Paititi mystery. Not linear, not definable, but recursive, reflective, alive. And as we peel away the vines and dig beneath stone, we must begin to wonder, are we uncovering a city, or are we awakening it? There is a curious pattern in the histories of forbidden places. Always, the moment someone draws too near, too precisely near, something intervenes. Expeditions end in disappearance or silence. Equipment fails. Permissions vanish. And often what remains behind is not fear, but reverence. Not a warning shouted, but a silence so deliberate it becomes its own kind of voice. If this is mere coincidence, then it is the most consistent accident in the historical record. Take the case of the 2003 Brazilian Peruvian expedition that penetrated deep into the borderland near the Rio Manu Basin. Funded partly through private investors and cloaked in academic language, the mission's real intent was to follow up on rumors from satellite anomalies, a cluster of symmetrical clearings not explainable by natural processes. They reached the first coordinates. Photographs were taken, samples collected. One of the team, a linguist named Rafael Monteiro, noted strange glyphs carved into a stone slab half buried beneath the jungle floor. He claimed they bore resemblance to Proto-Incan script, but with a cadence he'd never seen. Rhythmic, as though meant to be heard rather than read. 2 days later, the team lost all communication. Their last known message was a brief radio transmission. "It's not empty. We're not alone." They reappeared weeks later, emaciated, incoherent, without any of their records. What happened in that interval has never been publicly explained. The university overseeing the project cited a miscommunication and extreme environmental conditions. Monteiro resigned shortly after and has not spoken to the press since. His last academic paper is a single-page abstract later retracted, titled "Language as Landscape Auditory Structures in Pre-Columbian Glyph Systems." It was published then, withdrawn within a week. We are led to believe that mystery only survives because no one looks close enough. But the truth may be darker. Mystery survives because when we do get close, something rearranges the story, rewrites it, leaves only fragments where there were once full pictures, like footprints deliberately swept away before morning. And so Paititi endures not in spite of investigation, but because of the kind of investigation it inspires, one driven by conquest rather than communion, extraction rather than listening. This is not a city for invaders. It is not a site to be unearthed and caged behind museum glass. It is a sentinel, a mirror, and it seems to choose who may stand before it. We must begin to consider that Paititi is not unique, that it is part of a greater pattern, a global tapestry of lost places that share certain traits, remote locations, inexplicable knowledge systems, architectural impossibilities, and a trail of failed or sabotaged discoveries. From Shambhala to Agartha, from the underground cities of Cappadocia to the submerged ruins off the coast of Yonaguni, these places seem not so much lost as deliberately removed, like pages torn from a book whose contents remain too potent to be read aloud. What unites them is not culture or geography, but concealment. They were sealed away, not hidden from view, but from comprehension. And that may be the hardest truth to face, that we are not ready to know what they hold, because knowledge is not neutral. It transforms the knower. It rewrites the story we think we're living. And some truths demand a kind of psychological, even spiritual maturity we've not yet cultivated. Paititi, if it holds anything at all, may hold that kind of truth, the kind that doesn't just fill gaps in a timeline, but breaks the timeline entirely. So we must ask, what happens to a world where the Inca were not conquered, but concealed, where their knowledge wasn't lost but stored, where the myths we dismissed as stories were actually warnings. Perhaps that is why so many who seek Paititi report dreams not of cities or gold, but of choices, of standing before gates, of being asked a question they cannot remember upon waking, and always a sense that they've been seen, measured. There is one final account from 2017. A pilot named Valerio Rivas, flying a small charter plane over an unauthorized route near the Peruvian-Brazilian border, reported an impossibly symmetrical clearing appearing in the trees below. He circled twice. The instrument spiked. The cabin flooded with the scent of burning wood, though there was no fire. And then just before the clearing vanished behind the clouds, he saw what he later described as a stairway descending into the ground into light. When questioned, he admitted he hadn't slept since. Something looked back, he said. And whatever it wasn't ancient. It was waiting. We begin to understand slowly that the danger of Paititi is not in what it might reveal, but in what it might require. That to approach it is to shed more than fear, it is to abandon certainty, to be stripped of the narratives that have shaped our sense of identity power civilization, to step beyond the frontier of not just land, but belief. Because this is not a treasure hunt, it is an initiation, and not everyone is ready to be initiated. The word initiation carries weight. It implies crossing a threshold, not with weapons or tools, but with willingness. A ritual of passage not into power, but into perception. And this, perhaps more than anything else, is what separates Paititi from every other so-called lost city. It is not lost, it is veiled. And that veil is woven not from vines or distance, but from the inner condition of the one who seeks. Across time, certain places have functioned not merely as settlements, but as liminal zones, edges of reality, where the physical and the metaphysical brush against each other, where presence alone initiates a transformation. The Greeks had Delphi. The Egyptians had Abydos. The Tibetans, the caves of Milarepa. And for the Inca, for those before them, and those who still remember the jungle east of the Andes, thick-breathing sacred is one such place. Paititi, in this view, is not just a location. It is a sentient boundary. A gate disguised as a city, or perhaps a city built to be a gate. And to reach it without understanding, this is to arrive as a stranger in a temple not forbidden perhaps, but blind. Deaf to the resonance echoing through the stone. Uninvited. This perspective is echoed in accounts that never make it into formal archives. In 2019, an unpublicized expedition led by an Ecuadorian anthropologist named Javier Calles ventured into a section of jungle known among the Matses people as Ojinauya, the breath that sees. What they found were monoliths, large upright stones, arranged not in a line, but in a spiral, partially buried, eroded by centuries of rain and root. A local shaman told them these were anchors for the city that moves. Calls laughed at first, assuming poetic metaphor. But when they spent the night in the circle's center, each member of the team experienced the same recurring vision, a city in the mist alive, shifting, listening. No recordings were taken. All devices failed. But the next morning, they found in the dirt a single spiral, etched with a finger, one none of them remembered drawing. Why does this happen so often? Why do stories like these repeat across culture, region, and era? Not with identical imagery, but with strikingly parallel structures. A forbidden zone, a sacred map, an inner journey, a veil of silence, and always at the end, a feeling not of conquest, but of contact. Contact with what some say an ancient intelligence, Some say a memory field. Others believe Paititi represents the last surviving node of a network of pre-cataclysmic knowledge, a system that once spanned continents and whose fragments are now buried in places we call Myth, Atlantis Mu, Lemuria, Hyperborea. These names are easy to ridicule. They have become code words for fantasy targets for debunkers. But step outside the noise, and a deeper logic begins to surface. Across the world, unrelated ancient sites share impossible similarities. Stonework with no tool marks. Alignments with solstices and stars. Acoustics designed for vibration, not voice. In South America, the stones of Sacsayhuaman lock together so precisely that not even a needle can pass between them. In Bolivia, at Pumapunku, blocks weighing hundreds of tons were somehow moved, carved and arranged with mathematical perfection at altitudes where modern construction still struggles. Is this coincidence parallel evolution? Or were these cultures linked not by empire, but by understanding? If Paititi is one of these nodal points, then it is not merely lost, it has been hidden by necessity. Because if such a network ever truly existed, it implies a different origin for human knowledge altogether. One not of gradual ascent from primitivism, but of descent from an ancient peak of understanding into fragmentation and forgetfulness. And if that's the case, then Paititi may hold not just cultural history, but a kind of key, a reminder of what we were and perhaps what we are meant to become again. Of course, these are dangerous ideas. They threaten not just historical orthodoxy, but the foundations of identity and progress, which is why even whispers of such places are met with ridicule, not rebuttal. Serious researchers are taught not to ask these questions. Students are warned away. Grants are denied. And slowly, the memory of the mystery is choked until all that remains is myth safely ignored. But myths are not lies. They are containers of truth shaped to survive the fire. And so the story of Paititi survives not in textbooks, but in broken maps, in native lullabies, in spiral glyphs carved where no modern eyes were meant to look, in the trembling voice of an elder who refuses to say too much, in the haunted stare of an explorer who cannot explain what he saw. We are left with a sense that something enormous is just beneath the surface. Not a city of gold, but a civilization of meaning, a consciousness encoded in stone and song, camouflaged not by distance, but by our own refusal to look beyond what is comfortable. This raises the most disquieting question of all. What if we've already found Paititi? What if it has revealed itself over and over, only to be dismissed, buried again, not by jungle, but by disbelief? And what if it is waiting, not to be discovered, but to be recognized? Because recognition implies readiness. It implies change. And in a world built on forgetting, remembering is the most radical act of all. There comes a moment in every great mystery where the trail becomes less about what lies ahead and more about what lies within. A place where the path stops asking what you seek and starts asking why you are seeking. And if Paititi teaches us anything, it is that no one arrives unchanged. The further one moves into its mythic gravity, the more it reshapes the seeker's questions, peeling away layers of curiosity until only the essential remains. What am I willing to surrender? To know. We often think of hidden cities in physical terms, coordinates terrain stone. But the deeper we follow this story, the more that model begins to crumble. Because Paititi resists being measured, mapped, or captured. The more precisely one tries to define it, the more it slips into abstraction, like a dream that evaporates at the edge of waking. And yet, paradoxically, the more one listens quietly, humbly, the more tangible it becomes. This pattern is echoed in an obscure 1946 account from a missionary-turned-linguist named Father Alonso del Toro. Assigned to a remote village in the Madre de Dios region, he encountered an elderly man who spoke of a city of stone and wind that could only be entered by forgetting one's own name. When pressed, the man recited a chant in a language Alonso didn't recognize but phonetically transcribed. The translation, attempted much later by comparative ethnolinguists, rendered a chilling refrain. The city remembers what we forget. It sleeps until we are ready to remember again. Father Alonso never wrote of the chant again. In his final letter to the seminary, he wrote only, "There are truths so deep they become places. I have seen the outline of one. These strange glimpses accumulate like echoes, not enough for proof, but too persistent to ignore, too detailed to be coincidence. When scattered together across the decades, they form a kind of mosaic, half image, half invitation, not to find something, but to recognize it when it reveals itself again." This theme of remembrance keeps returning, not just as metaphor, but as the very key to the entire mystery. What if Paititi is not lost because it is hidden, but because we have lost the inner orientation that once allowed us to perceive it? Indigenous wisdom keepers have often spoken of seeing with the heart of knowledge that is not taught, but awakened. In Andean cosmology, the Capac Ñan, the great Inca road system, was not just a physical network. It was spiritual. A map across the mountains, yes, but also a path through consciousness, through moral structure and sacred relationship with the land. And where did that road end? Always east. Always into the Antisuyu. Into the forest that eats memory. Into the breath of the unknown. We are trained to ask what is in that jungle. But perhaps the question should be, what was preserved there that the modern world could not hold? Archaeologists working with LiDAR in recent years have confirmed the existence of immense interconnected urban zones beneath the Amazon basin. Raised causeways, defensive structures, road systems that defy all previous models of what was thought possible in the so-called pristine wilderness. The science is undeniable, but the story remains trapped in the language of shock, unbelievable discoveries, advanced unknown civilization, as if complexity in the jungle must always be an accident, a mistake, a puzzle to solve. But what if it is none of those things? What if the forest was the civilization, not merely its setting, but its temple? Not the environment it fought, but the consciousness it honored, lived within, and ultimately chose to disappear into, rather than see desecrated. This reframes Paititi not as a hidden object, but as a final act of resistance, a refusal to be consumed, a place preserved not in spite of the world that came after, but against it. And if that is the case, then the silence around it is no longer a mystery. It is a boundary of choice, one that must not be broken by force, but unlocked through transformation. This is not romanticism. This is what the evidence quietly screams from beneath every archaeological anomaly, every vanishing trail, every silenced expedition. Paititi does not protect a city. It is the protection. It is the sacred threshold where knowledge, culture, and consciousness were stored not to be hoarded, but to be revealed when the world no longer seeks to conquer it. And perhaps we are finally drawing near that time. There are signs. Modern scientists are beginning to speak of ecological intelligence. Quantum physicists write of entangled realities of consciousness as a field, not a byproduct. Ethnobotanists are decoding the pharmacological genius of indigenous plant knowledge long dismissed by laboratories. The Western world, fragmented by its own illusions of dominance, is beginning to turn back to the very wisdom it once called savage. And beneath that reversal, the outline of Paititi flickers, still waiting. Waiting not for discovery, but for a kind of collective humility, for a different kind of seeker. One who does not arrive with cameras and drills, but with questions that cannot be spoken aloud. What do we do when the jungle begins to whisper back? What do we do when myth turns out to be memory? Because if Paititi is real, and it is, it will not announce itself. It will not offer certainty. It will not explain. It will wait, as it always has, until we become the kind of people who can truly see. There are places in this world that don't just test what you believe, they unmake belief entirely. They strip you down, not with violence, but with revelation. You arrive with maps and theories, with the heavy armor of logic, and you leave with silence. Not because you've been defeated, but because you've been invited to understand that some truths are not meant to be known, they're meant to be lived. This is what those who've stood near the threshold of Paititi describe. Not a triumph of discovery, but a surrender of certainty. In 2020, a botanist named Luciana Esquivel led a research team into the edge of the Pantiacola Mountains. Their aim was unremarkable on the surface, a biodiversity study to catalog rare plants. No mention of ancient cities, no mention of myths, just flora and fauna. But what they found changed everything. Not because it was spectacular, but because it was impossible. Near the banks of a narrow, slow-moving river, they came upon a single tree. Nothing extraordinary in its shape or bark, but its leaves bore etched markings, fractal patterns so perfect, so mathematically ordered, that Luciana believed they were either a hoax or a message. She collected samples, ran chemical tests. The markings were not insect trails, not disease, not genetic mutation. Something or someone had altered the leaf's internal growth structure at the cellular level. As she documented the anomaly, one of her guides, an old Quechua man named Thomas, simply watched her in silence. When she asked if he had seen anything like this before, he nodded. "This is one of the guardians," he said. "It grows at the edge of what you cannot enter." He refused to go further. The team followed his example. Luciana wrote her findings in a personal notebook, not in her official field reports. She was afraid of ridicule, of having her work discredited. But she confided in one colleague who later published an anonymous blog post describing their conversation. In it, she reportedly said, "I felt like the forest was aware of me, as though it had let me see something, just enough to ask the right question, but not enough to answer it." This experience is not unique. Across the history of jungle exploration, the same feeling recurs in different forms. Explorers describe being watched by something that does not move, guided away from paths with no visible danger, warned by sudden changes in weather or animal behavior or overwhelming emotion, as if the very land were sentient, as if it remembered who was worthy of passing through and who was not. Science has no framework for this. It labels such experiences as psychological projection, confirmation bias, environmental stress. But these explanations, while useful, are also reductive. They flatten the multidimensional into the digestible. They turn the sacred into the symptomatic. And in doing so, they rob us of the one thing we cannot afford to lose in this pursuit: reverence. Without reverence, Paititi remains invisible. Without humility, its truth becomes noise. The jungle does not care for your degrees, your grant funding, your GPS. It responds to something older, deeper, an orientation of the spirit. And if that sounds like mysticism, it's only because we have forgotten how to listen with anything but our ears. Among the Inca people, there is a teaching the forest does not hide. It waits. This is not passivity. It is protection. In their stories, Paititi is not a relic. It is a still living covenant, a place kept alive by those who remember the laws of balance, the songs to be sung when the moon is full, the steps to walk without disturbing the ground. They believe the city is not hidden by trees, but by agreement, an ancient pact between land and memory. And here, we touch on something terrifying and beautiful, the possibility that we are not the only species on Earth that remembers, that the land itself remembers, that stone and water and tree are not just scenery, but witnesses, custodians of events too vast, too dangerous, or too sacred for history to hold. If Paititi is a sanctuary, then it is a sanctuary not just of knowledge, but of memory, a container for something we were not ready to carry forward, something we buried in myth until we could evolve enough to bear its weight again. And that moment may be drawing close. The climate is shifting. Old systems are breaking. Certainties once held sacred are now dissolving before our eyes. We are reaching the edge of what this version of the world can sustain. And just beyond that edge, perhaps Paititi waits, not as a city of escape, but as a mirror. What it reflects back to us is not fantasy or gold or conquest. It reflects the face of a world we left behind when we chose control over connection, a world of reciprocity, of encoded wisdom in birdsong and root, of technology embedded in relationship. It reflects the version of humanity that did not separate knowledge from reverent science from spirit or memory from place. And that is why it terrifies us. Because if we truly saw Paititi not through satellite, but through understanding, it would undo more than history. It would undo who we think we are. It would demand that we change. Because there are places we cannot enter until we become the kind of people who do not need to conquer them. There are questions we cannot answer until we stop demanding answers. And there are cities that will not show themselves until we remember how to knock. Imagine a city that vanishes when pursued, yet appears when forgotten. A place whose silence deepens the closer you come, not to mislead you, but to ask something more profound than where is it, to ask, what have you become in the seeking? That is the paradox at the heart of Paititi. Not lost, not hidden, but positioned with exquisite precision at the intersection of humility and awareness. It does not want to be found. It wants to be deserved. We live in a world trained to devour mysteries, to turn them into headlines, data artifacts. But some things cannot be possessed. They can only be participated in. Paititi does not yield to pressure. It does not open to conquest. Instead, it invites those who are willing to lose themselves, and in that loss, begin to see differently. In the early 1980s, a Quechua woman named Amalia Quispe became known in her remote community as the one who saw the hidden stone. Her story was dismissed by outsiders, but among her people, it became part of the oral canon. She spoke of wandering away during a rainstorm as a young girl, of sheltering beneath a limestone outcrop in the cloud forest, and of waking to find herself inside a circular room lit by no flame, where a language she did not understand filled the air like music. There were no people, only presence, only meaning. She emerged hours later soaked and changed, not broken, not afraid, but serene. She would never speak of what she heard inside that space. She would only say it was not meant for words. Years later, her son, a regional teacher, submitted the account to a folkloric journal. It was never published. Not because it was unbelievable, but because it could not be processed. It had no place within the known categories of experience. But perhaps this is the entire point. Paititi is a disruption. A challenge not to reality, but to the story we have told about what reality is allowed to be. It is not irrational. It is trans-rational, meaning it moves beyond logic without opposing it. It offers not contradiction, but expansion. Not myth versus fact, but myth as a deeper fact we haven't yet learned to recognize. When we treat ancient cultures as primitive, we don't just insult them, we blind ourselves. The Inca were not merely builders of stone. They were orchestrators of space vibration energy. Their temples were designed for resonance, for aligning human bodies with cosmic motion. They built without mortar, without iron, yet achieved structural stability that defies modern methods. Their quipu, a system of knotted cords, was more than accounting. Some believe it was multidimensional, writing a tactile language capable of storing narrative mathematics, even emotional states. And if this is true, then what else might they have preserved that we are still too limited to interpret? It's possible, even likely, that Paititi is not a relic of the past, but a seed from a civilization that never collapsed. It simply chose a different future. One we were not ready to follow. One we can barely comprehend. And like a seed, it waits beneath the soil of time, intact, dormant, alive. There are rumors, persistent quiet of people who have gone into the jungle and never returned. But these are not stories of death. They are stories of absorption, of integration. A German explorer named Lucas Neumann disappeared in 1998 during an unauthorized solo mission in southeastern Peru. His last journal entry recovered from a drop bag at a resupply point contained only this: "It's not a ruin. It's a mind. And it's dreaming me." We do not know what he meant, but others have echoed similar sensations, moments of dissolving, of being seen and assessed, not by a creature, not by a person, but by something ambient, architectural present in the space itself. The very geometry of the jungle shifting in subtle, conscious ways. What does it mean to be seen by a place? What does it mean to be remembered by a world that we've forgotten? We are taught that knowledge is something we possess. That truth is something to capture, store, publish. But the knowledge encoded in Paititi does not respond to that logic. It doesn't want to be known, it wants to be respected. And that is why the jungle guards it. Not with soldiers or walls, but with silence, with forgetting, with dreams that dissolve the ego. Perhaps this is the test, that the closer one gets to Paititi, the more one must shed assumptions, ambitions, even identity. Not to disappear, but to remember differently. To arrive not as an explorer, but as a witness. Not to take, but to receive, and in that receiving, to become something new. There's a reason so many who chase the city of gold come back changed, or not at all. Because gold was never the prize. Gold was the decoy, the bait for the greedy, the impatient, the blind. The real treasure has always been hidden in plain sight, a living map, a breathing intelligence, a city that speaks not in words, but in resonance. And the price of admission is not bravery, it is surrender. Because this city does not want your conquest, it wants your transformation. The idea that a city could demand transformation before revealing itself sounds like myth, a tale carved from the old bones of legend. And yet, what if this is the one part of the story we've misunderstood the most? What if it isn't metaphor at all, but the exact truth forgotten only because we no longer live in a world where places are allowed to have consciousness, where land itself can choose who may enter, or where knowledge requires more than intellect to receive? We are conditioned to believe that all places are open to those with enough technology, enough money, enough maps. But Paititi defies that assumption, not because it cannot be reached, but because it refuses to be taken. Its silence is not an absence of presence. It is a form of consent withheld, and this has always been its power. For those who grew up within the legacy of conquest, the idea of a city that cannot be conquered is deeply unsettling. But for the descendants of those who remembered how to listen, it is not unsettling, it is sacred. They speak of Paititi not as a place to be found, but as a memory to be honored, a responsibility, a guardian, the last piece of an ancient world that chose to retreat rather than be desecrated. In 2022, a little-known ecological survey near the Manu National Park reported data anomalies along a forest ridge no one had previously mapped. The canopy, viewed through multispectral analysis, revealed outlines of hexagonal formations, massive, deliberate, and spaced with uncanny precision. Not a settlement in the traditional sense, but not nature either. The shapes pulsed subtly with vegetation types that shouldn't grow in that region. Scientists speculated a microclimatic anomaly. A few suggested volcanic soil remnants, but local accounts told a different story. According to a Mashiguenga guide interviewed off-record, those hexagonal shapes were part of the old circle. He said they marked where the sky once bent down to kiss the ground, a poetic phrase easily dismissed until he added, "It was not always jungle here." Before the jungle grew, the city breathed in open light. This statement shook the researchers, not because of what it said, but because of what it implied that the forest itself was a shroud, grown not as nature's random overgrowth, but as intentional protection. A living curtain pulled across something too sacred for the post-conquest world to touch. Could a forest be planted with purpose? Could ecosystems be designed not just for survival, but for concealment? We already know that ancient Amazonian cultures practiced sophisticated agroforestry. The so-called terra preta, rich black soil, found in large areas of the rainforest, is human-made, cultivated to sustain high-density populations. This is not speculative. It is proven. These people understood the forest as a collaborator, not a wilderness. And if they could build with nature at that scale, could they have also buried their greatest sanctuary within it? Could Paititi be the result of the most elegant act of defiance ever performed by a civilization, that of disappearing into harmony? And if so, what does that say about the world we've inherited? It says we have mistaken silence for absence. It says we have confused invisibility with erasure. And it says that the greatest threat to Paititi was never time or jungle, but the mind of the colonizer, which could not recognize what would not submit. Because Paititi does not resist discovery. It resists misunderstanding. This is why the ancient myths never really try to describe the city in detail. They speak in riddles, in symbols, in invitations. The golden mirror, one elder called it. The city that shows you yourself. Another said it was not for the eyes, but for the soul behind them. These are not evasions. They are instructions, warnings. The ones who remember Paititi do not speak of entering it. They speak of becoming ready for it. It is not a destination. It is an awakening. And this changes everything. Because if Paititi is an intelligence, a memory, a consciousness encoded into place, then we are no longer looking for ruins. We are approaching a presence, one that sees the seeker as clearly as the seeker tries to see it. And here lies the risk. If you carry conquest in your heart, it will not let you close. If you seek it for validation, for gold, for proof, you will find only forest. And maybe not even that. But if you come empty, if you come asking not what it can give you, but what you must unlearn, then perhaps the path will begin to shape itself beneath your feet, subtle, unmarked, alive. Not everyone who searches is seeking truth. Some are seeking control, others escape, and still others story. But truth has never been a thing you find. It's a thing that finds you when you're ready to become its vessel. And so Paititi waits. It waits not for the explorers, not for the treasure hunters, not for the headlines. It waits for the quiet few who understand that some doors require silence to open, that some knowledge will not speak unless spoken to with love, that some places are not there to change the world, but to remember it into being again. And when that moment comes, when the seekers become the stewards, when reverence eclipses ambition, when humanity learns once more how to ask rather than to take, then perhaps Paititi will no longer need to be hidden, because the world it belongs to will have finally returned. It's easy to imagine the jungle as chaos and endless indifferent sprawl. But look closer. There is no chaos here. Only pattern, only design, so complex we mistake it for disorder. Every vine climbs with intention. Every canopy layer has a role. And beneath it all, the soil breathes with memory. In this sense, the Amazon is not wilderness. It is a library, a network, a language spoken through leaf and root and silence. And somewhere within that network, Paititi waits, not as an abandoned ruin, but as a sentence never finished waiting for the right voice to complete it. We have walked through centuries of confusion to reach this threshold. Our institutions have called it myth. Our maps have left it blank. And our stories for generations have turned it into something consumable, a city of gold, a legend to chase. But those who have come closest, who have stood just shy of its invisible perimeter, speak of something very different. They speak of presence, not past, not dead, but awake. One of the most compelling modern accounts comes from a woman named Noelia Vargas, a linguist with a background in semiotics and indigenous symbolism. In 2014, while traveling along the Rio Tambopata with a team studying disappearing dialects, she stayed for several days in a small village rarely visited by outsiders. One evening, a boy no older than 10 handed her a folded piece of banana leaf. Inside was a drawing, simple lines made with charcoal, but arranged in a pattern that caught her immediately. She didn't recognize the form itself, but she recognized its structure. It was organized like language, recursive, nonlinear, symbolic in a way that suggested encoding, not illustration. When she asked the boy where he'd seen it, he pointed toward the mountains. "It's from the place my grandfather said. We forget," he told her. Noelia traced the pattern in her journal and studied it for years. It had no known correlation to native scripts or weaving patterns. But one day by chance, she placed a transparency of the drawing over a topographic map of the Manu Basin, and something clicked. The contours matched a stretch of uncharted ridgeline almost perfectly. It was a map, but not a traditional one. It was spatial and symbolic, a map of meaning, not just geography. She realized it could only be understood by someone trained to read the land emotionally, not mechanically. This experience changed her forever. In a lecture she gave before vanishing from public view in 2018, she said, "Paititi is not hidden. We just forgot how to see it. It's written in a grammar of resonance. Until we remember how to speak that language again, the city will remain silent." A grammar of resonance. That phrase lingers because what does it mean to read a place emotionally? What does it mean to navigate not by landmarks, but by states of being? Could it be that the Inca and those who came before them used emotional intelligence, harmonic frequencies, and collective memory to encode access to sacred spaces? Could the jungle itself be a living interface, responding only when certain conditions of presence are met? It's not as implausible as it sounds. Indigenous traditions across the planet describe places that only appear under specific internal states. Sacred groves, spirit lakes, invisible paths. These are dismissed as hallucinations or folk tales, but often they persist with stunning consistency. And in each of them lies a similar theme: access through transformation. Not by force, not by chance, but by alignment. This redefines the quest for Paititi. It is not a matter of reaching a place, but becoming the kind of person who can resonate with it. The search becomes inward. The clues become reflective. The journey becomes a mirror, and that mirror can be brutal. Because it doesn't just reflect our desire to know, it reflects our reasons for wanting to know. It reveals the hunger beneath the question. It reveals whether we are here to possess or to listen. And if we are not ready, it does not scold. It simply vanishes, like a dream that withdraws before it can be written down. This too is the city's wisdom: to protect what cannot be abused, to remain until the world is ready to receive, not to dominate. And yet that readiness may be closer than we think. All around us, the old systems are cracking. The age of endless growth of conquest, masked as progress, is collapsing under its own weight. Climate chaos, technological overload, social fragmentation, these are not random. They are symptoms of a worldview that sees the earth as object, not relation. That treats wisdom as data and story as entertainment. But that world is dying, and in its place, something older, quieter, and more reverent is trying to return. Maybe that's why the legend of Paititi is rising again now, not as myth, but as invitation. An invitation to remember how to be in relationship, with land, with time, with each other. Maybe Paititi has been calling all along, not to lead us to itself, but to lead us back to ourselves. Because if we ever do enter that sacred place, if we ever do pass through whatever unseen gate protects it, we will not be the same. We will not leave carrying gold or artifacts. We will leave carrying memory, not just of a city, but of a way of being, a mode of awareness, a lost grammar of how to live. And that may be the most valuable treasure of all. There is a silence that does not feel empty, but full. A presence that does not shout, but waits quietly with the gravity of something ancient and alive. That is the silence surrounding Paititi. It is not a void to be filled with theory or conquest. It is a presence that asks you to slow down, to stop grasping, and to listen. Because if you listen closely, you begin to realize the story of Paititi was never just about a place. It has always been about a choice, not a decision made in a single moment, but a deeper, slower turning of the soul. A long-forgotten agreement between humanity and the land itself, a covenant not written in text, but in feeling. Reciprocity, reverence, presence. These were the keys to the city, not maps or machetes. And in that way, Paititi has never truly been closed. It has simply waited for us to remember the code. Across the Andes, in sacred sites like Choqquequirao, Ollantaytambo, and Vilcabamba, echoes of this memory still linger. The stones hum, the shadows align, and the architecture speaks not in function, but in resonance. The Incas were not building structures in the modern sense. They were sculpting relationships between light and stone, between water and sound, between heaven and the human spirit. Their cities were not just places to live. They were instruments, portals, chords struck across the surface of the earth to keep the world in harmony. What then was Paititi? If these other places were visible notes in the sacred song of the Andes, Paititi was the silence between them, the breath that gives meaning to the melody. It was the hidden refrain, the heart of the song that could only be heard when all else had been stripped away. This is not poetic metaphor. It is architecture as cosmology. And that cosmology tells us something vital, that when the world broke, when the balance was shattered by conquest, by greed, by forgetting, Paititi did not fall. It receded. It stepped out of the narrative, sealed itself in silence, and waited, not to be discovered, to be deserved. And slowly, impossibly, we are finding our way back. In recent years, indigenous leaders from the Andes and Amazon have begun to speak more boldly, more clearly of what Paititi means. Not just as legend, but as living legacy. They do not describe it as a ruin. They describe it as a memory keeper, a place where the wisdom of their ancestors is still being held intact, untouched alive. And they speak not of opening it, but of protecting it until the world is no longer a threat to what it holds. This is where the mirror becomes sharp. Because to approach Paititi is to be confronted with the question, can we be trusted with what we have forgotten? This question is not hypothetical. It is an invitation. And it is one we have failed many times. We have looted tombs, rewritten myths, desecrated sacred sites in the name of knowledge and wealth. We have treated the earth as a resource, not a relationship. And in doing so, we have made ourselves strangers to the very wisdom that could save us. But perhaps that estrangement was always temporary. Perhaps the reason Paititi still pulses beneath the green is because it knows that forgetting is not forever. There are signs now, small, scattered, luminous. Indigenous languages once dying are being spoken again. Sacred songs are being remembered. Lineages thought lost are rising in quiet strength, not to fight, not to claim, but to steward, because stewardship, not ownership, has always been the highest form of power in the old world. And maybe the seekers are changing too. Not the treasure hunters, not the glory seekers, but a new kind of pilgrim. People walking into the unknown, not to prove anything, but to listen. People who understand that some paths do not lead forward, they lead inward. That some doors cannot be unlocked with intellect or tools, but only with presence, stillness. A return to what was once so natural it never needed to be taught. Paititi then becomes not the end of the journey, but its beginning. Not the treasure, but the turning. The quiet place where the world you once knew dissolves, and something ancient inside you stirs something that remembers the songs of water, the maps in cloud, shadows, the language of wind moving through stone. And in that moment, whether you see the city or not, whether the path opens or closes, something within you has already changed. Because you have remembered that there are places older than history, deeper than myth, and more alive than anything we've dared to believe. and that those places are not outside you. They are within you waiting, like Paititi. So here we are, at the final bend in the river, at the edge of what can be said and the beginning of what can only be felt. We have walked through centuries of silence and contradiction, through jungles of shadow and story. And now, as we draw close to the place we've been calling Paititi, something inside us understands this has never been a search for a city. It has always been a search for ourselves, for something we lost, not in maps or in books, but in memory. In the way we once stood beneath the sky and knew it was speaking to us. In the way we once touched the earth and felt her pulse answer. In the way we once lived, not above the land, but within it. The myth of Paititi has endured because it is more than legend. It is a wound that still sings, a song that survived the fire. It has moved through time like a thread of light hidden beneath centuries of ash, waiting to be picked up by hands that no longer shake with the need to own, but with the readiness to receive. And the final truth is this: we were never meant to find Paititi until we no longer needed to, because what it holds cannot live in a world addicted to conquest. It cannot breathe in the air of empire. It cannot bloom in the soil of denial. What it holds, this ancient pulse of wisdom, harmony, memory, requires a different kind of world. One where presence is valued more than speed. One where silence is honored as much as speech. One where reverence is not weakness, but power. We are not there yet, but perhaps we are closer than we think. In this age of collapse and reckoning, as the myths we once called progress crumble around us, the old stories return not to comfort, but to correct. And Paititi is one of the oldest. It is not just a place. It is a compass, a reminder, a truth encoded in the shape of longing. It says, there was once a world where people lived in balance, and it did not die. It went into hiding. It says, not all ruins are broken. It says, there is a city in the forest that still dreams. And if you listen closely, you might feel it dreaming you back. And if one day you find yourself standing at the edge of a mist-veiled ridge with no trail to follow and no sound but your breath, listen. Not for voices, not for signs, but for that subtle shift inside where something ancient remembers itself. That is the door. It will not open with force. It will not respond to urgency. But if you are still and honest and willing to walk the rest of the way, not with your feet, but with your awareness, perhaps it will open. Perhaps the mist will part. Perhaps the forest will breathe, and the land will say softly, you have remembered. Welcome home. And then, only then, will you understand the final paradox of Paititi, that it was never hidden. You were.